and then F12. Welcome to this week's episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show. My name is Edwin Sarmiento, and welcome if you're joining in for the very first time. The purpose of the Practical SQL Server HA show is to share tips and tricks, best practices, even not so best practices, lessons learned, mistakes made, for anything related to SQL Server high availability and disaster recovery. And we're not just talking about features. We're not just talking about your SQL Server always on availability groups, failover clustered instances, log shipping, accelerated database recovery. Beyond that, we're looking at the entire thing because high availability and disaster recovery is never just about technology. It's about people and processes incorporated with your technology solutions to provide high availability and disaster recovery to your database platforms. And this episode is kind of like a follow-up to the one that I did in the last episode, asking the 3 questions about your existing SQL Server HADR solutions for the new year. It's the perfect time for you to start looking at your entire infrastructure, particularly your database platforms, to get a sense of the amount of work that you need to do within the year. Plan for it as early as now so you can allocate time, resources, even staff, in order for you to be ready for that. And I talked about 3 things about whether or not your existing high availability solutions still meet the business requirements, what your modernization strategy will look like for the entire year, and whether or not you have enough staff to still support your existing high availability and or disaster recovery solution. This episode, let me put up a slide there, focuses on one of those questions. I want to dive deep into this. I've gotten some questions on LinkedIn and Instant Messenger as well, asking questions about, so what are the different things that I need to look at when evaluating my existing high availability and or disaster recovery solutions. Although in the previous episode, I kind of gave you an idea, like provided some examples. We're going to dive deeper into this, and this episode is not meant to be a comprehensive dive, but just to give you ideas on what are other options, what are other alternatives that you can look at, ideas to explore whether or not your existing high availability and or disaster recovery solutions still meet your business requirements. Grab your pen and paper, take notes. Let's dive right in. First one, backups. And I know I already talked about this in the previous episode, but also there's really no escaping backups. And it's interesting in the conversations around high availability, disaster recovery, backups will always be there. And the one thing I think about when I look at backups, it's really it's a basic human need, whether we think about it or not. I think about it in terms of it's really a basic human need. We go back to the days before data existed, before computers even existed. Our ancestors started scribbling and making sketches on caves as cavemen. And then when paper was invented, we started writing information on paper, our ideas, history, data, anything that we've learned, observations about nature. And these are things that we want to preserve because of our basic human need to preserve ourselves forever, sort of. I know it's it's philosophical conversation. In the same way, one of the reasons why databases became a thing, it's more than just we want to store data in something, whether that's a flat file, spreadsheets are still a thing. But relational databases existed for the very reason that we wanted to meet that basic human need of persisting ourselves and preserving ourselves for eternity, of course. The reality is we don't live forever, but we want that. We want to preserve whatever it is that we produce, we create as a reflection of who we are, and we preserve that forever. That's one of the reasons, again, In addition to having something like a database, we have backups. Although nowadays we start to think about it as, hey, in case something goes wrong, we can restore from backups, right? But again, underneath the need for restoring our data in case something goes wrong is that deep human need. And that's also one reason we can never get away from the idea of having backups. We can even talk about having backups for the photos, contacts on your phone. Pretty straightforward. We use our phones every day. So backup, we can really never get away from the conversations around backups, implementing things. The world will evolve. Go back to the days of magnetic tapes, when those were the things that we used for backups. Okay. Now we are copying stuff, or we're backing stuff up on storage media, digital storage media like hard drives. And so, again, this is more than just protecting your existing data. This is an opportunity for you to reevaluate what portions of the business, and I know I went from philosophical to business, you have to reevaluate every system, every infrastructure, every data platform in your organization, and assess which of those are mission critical. Of course, not all systems are created equal. Assess which of those are critical, and then plan accordingly as to what your recovery point, recovery time objectives are, and then plan your backup strategy and restore strategy with those. Now, like I said, we can never really get away from backups. Every database administrator or every data platform professional responsibility include, in one way, shape, or form, protecting databases in a form of backup. So how do you evaluate these? First, how large are your backups right now? How large are they? Sure, when you started, maybe, I'll use an example, maybe in the beginning, when you started one SQL Server instance, you've got like 25 databases in there, roughly averaging around 500 gigs to about 1 terabyte. Database size, that is, not data size. Of course, database size does not mean data size. Your backups will only contain data size. So you could have 1 terabyte size database, but the data in there is about 500 gigs. So you can correlate the size of the data with the size of your backup. Okay? As the business grew, so let's say that's what you did on day 1. Day 365, 1 year has passed. The database grew to maybe roughly around, initially it was 1 terabyte, now it's around 2 terabytes. The size of the data is around 1.2 terabytes. Your backup size, again, correlating with the size of the data, possibly 1.2 terabytes. As your backups grow together with your databases, how long did it take for you to complete the backup? Because the larger your backups grow, the longer it takes for it to grow. Okay? And these are cases when you need to start re-evaluating not just the not just the size of your backup files, but the duration. Because this is where you start tweaking your backups, backup commands, introducing stuff like, maybe I should stripe my backups across multiple files. Maybe I should increase my max buffer size. And these are things and parameters that you can add to your backup commands in order for you to take advantage of whatever resources you have. Maybe you have multiple drive letters, or not just drive letters, because they could also be sitting on the same storage volume. Maybe multiple LUNs, and then you stripe your backups across those so that you can still compress, not just compress, but really take advantage of all the resources available so you can shorten the backup duration. Okay, again, the larger your backup files, the longer they're going to take to complete, not to mention to restore. But also part of that is the amount of space that you need. You also have to plan for how much space you need, not just from the point of view of local storage for your backups, because you might have a strategy where your backups are first stored locally, and then an enterprise backup would take that local a file. So you may need to forecast based on the size of your backups, forecast availability of storage locally and availability of storage on your enterprise backups. Okay. How long does it take to restore? And I've said this so many times, and I've been saying this to my customers. I don't really believe in backups because I've been burned so many times by backups that don't actually work. I believe in successfully restoring from your backups. So how long does it take to restore? Again, using that example, initially you have a 1 terabyte size database on average across all 25 databases. As the business grows throughout the year, you increase your database size to 2 terabyte, but the size of your data is around 1.2 terabyte. How large are the backups, and how long did it take to restore those backups? Of course, on the assumption that you're testing restores. When was the last time you tested your restores? Again, this is part of what you need to evaluate. Take, one of your latest backups, maybe one of the largest backups you have, test restore. How long does it take? Okay, and there are challenges with testing restores. Primarily, again, limited resources. You might not have the same compute and storage resources available for testing your backups and restoring those backups. But of course, that's not an excuse. Okay, in today's age of virtualization and public cloud infrastructures, especially with a cheaper storage, cheaper hardware, there is no excuse for you to not test your backups. Even if part of the automation process is create a VM, attach a LUN large enough to restore for one SQL Server instance. Once the backup completes, delete the entire setup, recreate a new one for the next SQL Server instance until you've tested all of your SQL Server instance backups. Again, not saying you have to manually do this, but if you can automate the process, you have a workflow that you can use to test whether or not your backups work. And not only that, okay, we've gone beyond, well, first you have to have backups. Then you have to test and validate how large your backups are. Then you have to test restoring those backups. But it goes beyond simply testing your backups. What about how long does it take? Okay, hence the question for validating your existing or evaluating your existing HADR solutions. How long does it take for a restore to complete? And does that restore time still meet your recovery time objective? Okay. The example that I use here is when a customer would say, "Hey, we want full database backups every day, and then transaction log backups let's say every half an hour instead of 15 minutes. Every half an hour, so that's 48 log backups within a span of 24 hours. Sure, you're covered with your recovery point objective, but what about restoring the full database backup and the 47, let's say 47 or 48 log backups? You're covered as far as your recovery point objective of 30 minutes is concerned, but what about restoring from backups? How long will it take for you to restore the full and the succeeding 47 or 48 log backups as part of your backup strategy? Does it meet your recovery objectives? Okay, and these two go hand in hand because the size of your backups, full, log, or differential, will determine the amount of time it takes to restore. And this is also, again, one of the reasons why you may have to reevaluate your existing strategies. Have I implemented backup compression when I configured my backup strategy? Because a compressed backup is smaller, will take a shorter time, faster time to restore as well. Okay, a lot of these come into reevaluating your existing HADR solutions. And as I mentioned in the previous question, do your restores still meet your RPO, RTO, and SLA? Just because you have a combination of full and log backups that would meet your recovery point objective doesn't mean that it would also meet your recovery time objectives. And that's also, again, going back to that, that's one of the reasons why you tweak some of the parameters that you use when you're configuring your backups, like max buffer size, maybe stripe the backups across multiple backup media. That way you can, when you're restoring, you're also taking advantage of striped backups. Now you have multiple threads processing the different backup files so that the restore will be a lot faster as well. Okay, testing that. Now, what about your existing, because that was just for backups. Okay, that was just for backups. What about your existing high availability solutions like always on available groups or failover clustered instances? And I know you might be thinking, why did he not include database mirroring? Well, a lot of customers don't want to implement database mirroring because it's technically deprecated. But just because it's deprecated doesn't mean it's no longer supported. It's still supported. You can still use it. Whether you're on standard edition or enterprise edition, you can still use it. Okay? And Microsoft is not going to turn you away when you call Microsoft for support about a database mirroring issue. Anyway, so what about for your available groups or failover clustered instances? Ask the question, how long is the failover? When was the last time you did a failover? And did you measure the amount of takes for it to fail over? Okay, depending on, like for instance, in an availability group, your failover time is a lot faster. So when you're designing and when you're implementing an always-on availability groups, you kind of expected that failing over an availability group is a lot faster than failing over a failover clustered instance. Why? Because in an availability group, the SQL Server service on the standby node or the standby replica or the secondary replica is constantly doing redo. So failover will only do, well, not only, well, will not, let me put it that way. A failover will not do the complete recovery process, meaning because redo is already happening on the secondary replica, a failover may only do the run the undo. Of course, if there's a lot of log records on the redo queue, SQL Server will finish running redo until the redo queue has been processed, and then the undo happens and brings the entire available group online, meaning all the databases in the available group online. In contrast with failover clustered instance, you're running the entire crash recovery because the standby node is not doing anything. SQL Server service is not even starting or started. Okay, SQL Server service is only started on the primary node or the active node, as most people will call it. And so when you do a failover, it's as if you're restarting SQL Server. So full restart of SQL Server is definitely going to be longer than a failover of an availability group where you have a standby running redo in the background. But go back to the question, how long is the failover? Okay, I'll use the example again of let's say 25 databases. Every single database is about 1 terabyte on average. At the end of the year, database size grew to 2 terabytes. Data size is around 1.2 terabytes. How much transaction log records are generated per database? Because transaction log records will impact the amount of time to failover. Okay, and one of the reasons we started off with backups is because you need to have an idea of how much transaction log records are generated on a per database level. You do that by looking at the backup history. When you configure your backup log backups per database, you have a history of the amount of transaction log records generated on a per frequency basis. Meaning, if you're running it on every 15 minutes, you have history of log backups every 15 minutes and the size of the log backups within those 15-minute intervals. This gives you an idea of the amount of transaction log records generated. Are they increasing? Okay. I wouldn't assume that they would be decreasing, unless, of course, you started off with an, I don't want to say inefficient, but you started off with improperly designed database, and then you start tweaking and make modifications to the transaction that they're shorter, okay, shorter, and then eventually you configure the, the database to generate fewer transaction log records. Or maybe you decided, hey, we want to jump into SQL Server 2019 and hopefully not upgrading to 2019 at this time. You should be at least on 2022 or get the latest and the greatest. But imagine upgrading, part of the modernization strategy. You decide you want to upgrade your database, put them on 2022 or 2025, and then you enable accelerated database recovery. Turn it on, okay? Which shortens the amount of transactions, or not shortens, decreases the amount of transaction log records generated, therefore increasing your failover, okay? So in addition to looking at the backup history, evaluating your backups and looking at the backup history to determine the amount of transaction log records generated per database, because this will impact your failover time both for availability groups and failover clustered instances, you also want to take a look at what other factors can impact my failover time. And I've given an example of that where the volume of transaction log records generated on a per database excuse me, basis on an availability group will impact your failover time. Same thing with failover clustered instances. Okay, how many databases in an availability group? Of course, there's this documentation that says 100 databases per availability group. That's not a hard and fast rule. It's not a set in stone kind of thing. It still depends on the availability of your compute and storage resources. Okay, because when you add more databases in an availability group, you're asking SQL Server to have additional threads to process, sending transaction log records from the primary to the secondary, processing redo on the secondary. All of these things are happening while you're still serving transactions to your applications. And so the amount of databases that you add on to an availability group, or even a failover clustered instance, because again, when you do a failover, the entire instance gets failed over, okay? And it becomes a little bit more challenging managing the failover time, managing the amount of resources. I've seen customers who started out with around 15 to 20 databases in an availability group. Company grew, businesses grew, the business grew, data grew. Therefore, they want to add more databases to existing available groups. Instead of spinning up new SQL Server instances, they want to save on licenses, okay? Because regardless whether you have one massively large availability group with 100 databases, or you have like 5 availability groups, each with 20 databases, you're still consuming the same compute and storage resources for your existing setup. Like I said, I've seen cases of customers who would just add on databases to an existing availability group instead of spinning up a new infrastructure, a new failover cluster with SQL Server instances as replicas, because the way they think about it is, oh, that's an additional license. I want to cut down on license. I don't want to spend more on license. Why don't I just shove in more databases in there? Okay, and when that thing happens, it's not just the performance that will be affected, it's also your recovery point and recovery time objective. Because now you would require more compute and storage resources to process those databases for availability groups. Again, sending those log records over to the secondary running redo. So you have to, you're going to end up increasing compute resources anyway. So it's really all about the balancing the cost. I don't see it as a cost. I see it as an investment in the growth of the company. Okay. What about third-party solutions? Third-party solutions are things that sometimes we don't think about. Mainly because when you look at some of the tutorials, YouTube videos, or even trainings from vendors, they would zoom in on that one product that they're trying to teach you about. If that's Microsoft, that's SQL Server. If that's NetApp, it's just NetApp. But here's the reality. In the real world, there's no such thing as top to bottom all Microsoft thing. Why? Because your hardware is not Microsoft. Your storage is not Microsoft. And so you are going to incorporate third-party things. What are those things? Enterprise backup, stuff like Net Backup or Data Protection Manager, TSM, or Commvault. In a large organization, you will have an enterprise backup team, and they get to dictate how to implement enterprise backup solutions. SQL Server is just one piece of the larger enterprise. Stuff like VM-based backups, if you're running SQL Server on virtual machines, whether that's Hyper-V or VMware or Nutanix, you will have a third-party solution. Other than the fact that your virtual machine platform in and of itself, your virtualization platform is a third party. Okay. What about backups or DR solutions? You're looking at Rubrik, Zerto, Datto, and all of these, other than being included as part of your enterprise backup, DR solutions would include these as well. What about the storage area networks? Maybe your storage admins decided we want to include this, or we want to introduce this brand new storage area network, but they're not telling you about the other features. Stuff like snapshots, using snapshots as a backup. Like for instance, when I used to work with a customer where they were using NetApp as their entire storage layer. And to take advantage of the storage layer, they've incorporated Snap Manager for SQL Server as an add-on to NetApp so that they can use their NetApp appliance, storage appliance, to take the backup of the entire SQL Server estate. So it doesn't matter if they have like 200 plus SQL Server instances. We're not talking about databases, instances, meaning servers. And every single SQL Server instance is a default instance. Imagine that, 200 plus machines, physical machines, all running on NetApp, and they're using Snap Manager for SQL Server to take advantage of their storage appliance, taking backups of all 200 SQL Server instances. What about SQL Server specific backups, stuff like Redgate, Quest, and IDR? And I'm just introducing all of these because I'm pretty sure you have one or more third-party solution. Could be a combination of VM-based backups or SAN snapshots that you can use as backups. Okay? Have they been recently introduced? Maybe you're not aware. Again, your enterprise backup team introduced a new feature that they're using with their enterprise backup solution. Or maybe they decided, let's scrap this thing that we have been using because it's not meeting our business objectives or business requirements. Let's introduce another enterprise backup solution. Okay? How does that factor into how you back up your database, SQL Server databases? Okay? Can they meet the demands? Oh, by the way, one thing I've recently seen is hardware refreshes. We're introducing this brand new hardware. Oh, and part of this is we're introducing this new SAN. Ask your storage area network administrators if they have, if they're aware of any backup capability that the storage subsystem includes. Okay, or maybe you're moving away from VMware because of the increase in licensing costs, and you're moving to a new hypervisor platform like Nutanix, for instance. What are you going to be using as part of backing up virtual machines, or are they going to be introducing an agent that will take advantage of the SQL Server backup APIs? So that you're backing up the VMs and the SQL Server databases outside of it. Can they meet the demands? Your backup solutions. Okay. Again, we're not talking about SQL Server native backups here. We're talking about third-party backups, DR solutions, hardware platforms that you can use. Can they meet the demands? And I've seen cases. Recently worked with a customer where they were using Commvault, and they were using Commvault for all of their infrastructure systems. including SQL Server databases. Before the databases were added to an availability group, everything was humming along, everything was fine, and they were testing it. The minute that they added those same databases in an availability group, Commvault was not performing the way it did. For them, that is, of course, maybe different for you. But this is the thing though. You may have been using an enterprise backup solution before and it was working fine. It was taking the backups, it was restored, you were using it to restore backups properly, you validated, but now you've created something else. Like in that case, they've added the databases to an availability group. Does your enterprise backup solution still meet the demands of what it's designed for? Okay, I believe what they did was they got in touch with Commvault and asked for support so that they can tweak Commvault to use a specific script so that they can take a backup of the databases inside the available group. Okay. Another customer that I worked with 2 years ago, they were using Zerto as their DR solution. What they did was on premises they had everything that they needed. HPE Nimble for their storage, VMware for all the VMs, and then on their DR site, completely isolated from their production environment, they recreated everything as if it looked like the production. Same server names, same host name, same domain name, same everything. And the way they did their DR was they will use Zerto, have an exact copy of their production data infrastructure restored on their DR. One of the things that they had issues with, it was working for several months until this one time where when they restored their backups onto their DR, their availability groups could not start. They were it's as if they were doing a lift and shift, taking the entire production infrastructure, restoring it on their DR site. Worked for months, meaning they could bring up the AGs, bring up the databases, test everything was working fine. This one time, they tested, and part of their regulatory requirements was to do a monthly DR test. Monthly, man, that's a lot of work. They're doing this monthly DR test, and lo and behold, one time they did the DR test, no database, no AG, no failover cluster came back online. We started looking at the logs of why it happened, and we found out that there was some broken chain between what was restored from their backups to the DR and the DNS. That was clear. And then I asked them, what changed recently? They were told to make some modifications to the backups, and this is exactly what they did. And after they did this, it changed the way the restore happened. I told them, this is one of the things that a lot of vendors, third-party vendors will do, is they will come up with a blanket practice. That's also one of the reasons why you probably heard me a couple of times say, not really a big fan of best practices, because the best practices have to be evaluated against your specific environment. Besides, you don't have the vendors' resources, their money, their engineering, their skills. So you have to tweak the best practice recommendations according to your internal system. Okay. What else? How do they fit in your DR process? On the assumption, of course, that you have a well-written, validated, and tested DR process. Okay. This is going to be part of what you need to evaluate. Once you've introduced a third-party solution, not just making sure that it meets the demand, still meets the demand, you have to test if this particular thing that you've added can be restored, can be recovered properly by following your DR. Maybe you need to tweak your existing DR process. Maybe you need to change it completely because it no longer meets whatever it is that you're trying to do using this third-party solution. And I can go on and explore more about these when it comes to third-party solutions, because I've seen so many cases of customers just incorporating a third-party solution, testing the production aspect of it, but not the DR aspect. Sure, it works, we've used it, we validated it, but in a production setting. But because they have not done any DR test yet, after implementing the third-party solution, they've never really validated whether or not it still works. Okay, there's so many things to consider. I just gave you kind of like the guidelines on properly evaluating your existing high availability and/or disaster recovery solution, whether or not they still meet the business requirements. And if not, you got an entire year ahead of you to prepare and plan and come up with the proper implementation, proper modification to make sure that your existing HADR solutions still meet your business requirements, whether that's through your backups, your existing SQL Server high availability and/or disaster recovery solutions, or introducing third-party solutions within your infrastructure. That is about it. I've gone longer than I expected with this, but that's about it for this week's episode of the Practical SQL Server HADR show. Tune in again next week for another episode, and if you need help with anything SQL Server high availability and/or disaster recovery solutions, maybe you're in the process of evaluating a solution, maybe you're planning on deploying but you don't have the right capabilities on staff, or maybe you have an existing always on available group or failover club or any type of SQL Server high availability and/or disaster recovery solution, and you're spending so much time trying to troubleshoot issues outage after outage and you can't figure out what's wrong with it. Use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session, and let's have that conversation. We'll look at what the real problem is. We'll explore your challenges and come up with a strategy on how to address those challenges and issues. Not on the spot, of course, but maybe come up with ideas on how to resolve that immediately. Again, use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session. This will lead you to my calendar page where you can pick and choose a time that works for you. That is all I have for this week's episode of the Practical SQL Server HADR show. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. I like to say weekend because it's great to enjoy the weekend. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. I'll see you again in the next episode.